One of the most important areas where young people need guidance today is in the area of romance and courtship. I've been the chairman of a secular university department with over 600 students and have had to support many students who've experienced severe problems in romantic relationships. I've had undergraduate students come to me to tell me they are so devastated by a relationship split that they feel unable to continue with their studies. I've also been a pastor in a church and had to provide support and teaching to young people in the area of courtship. So I have seen firsthand the blessings of purity in courtship and the serious problems of going against God's design for romance. And I've seen these things in both a secular setting and a Christian setting. I've also written a book called God's Way for Romance to give detailed biblical arguments for purity before marriage. The aim of this talk is to show that the Bible teaches that people should save themselves for marriage in both an emotional sense and a sexual sense. Saving yourself emotionally means not belonging to a romantic partner before marriage. Saving yourself sexually means not giving away your body before marriage. Of course, it is not easy to stay pure before marriage, especially in our modern society, which constantly promotes lust and all kinds of sexual immorality. However, it is important to have a goal of purity before marriage. There are several very important questions with respect to courtship which we will seek to answer using biblical teaching. What are the biblical arguments for abstaining from intimate relationships? What are the biblical arguments for abstaining from sexual intimacy before marriage? Should the aim of courtship be to investigate marriage, or can courtship be carried out just for pleasure? When is a person old enough to start courting? And how should you choose who to court? How should courtship be conducted? And finally, questions relating to engagement, such as how long it should be. Before we consider these important questions, I want to make some introductory points. Firstly, it is helpful to clarify why it is difficult to follow biblical teaching in this area. Sadly, we live in a world that has rejected biblical standards of conduct in the area of sexual morality and courtship. In past generations, people looked to the Bible for standards of conduct, and therefore there was peer pressure in society for people to save themselves for marriage by abstaining from intimate relationships before marriage. In contrast, people now follow the examples given by the entertainment industry. Since films and pop music portray sex and relationships outside of marriage as normal, this is what society views as morally acceptable behaviour. We now live in a world that says you should not wait until marriage for romantic pleasures, but rather to have them now. We also live in a world that puts pressure on young people to have intimate relationships for fun, regardless of whether they are interested in marriage. The modern world has what I call a relationship culture, where single people are under pressure to have intimate relationships outside of marriage. The entertainment industry also teaches that romance can be driven by lustful thoughts. It encourages women to dress seductively, and it encourages men to choose women mainly based on their physical looks. Sadly, some people in the church are adopting worldly standards of conduct in the area of romance and courtship. There are people having intimate relationships from a very young age and going through relationship splits. There are even incidents of pregnancies amongst unmarried church members. Therefore, it is important for the church to teach biblical standards of courtship. Secondly, I want to give an encouraging message to those who have made mistakes in this area. Many Christians have messed up in the area of romance, but have known God's complete forgiveness. Even the psalmist, King David, committed serious sexual immorality, and he obtained forgiveness. It is never too late to reform your ways and to start following biblical standards. I know people who have changed from a worldly lifestyle to a biblical lifestyle and have been greatly blessed. Let's now look at the questions relating to courtship. It should be noted that I will generally use the term intimate relationships to refer to situations where two people have given their heart and body to each other. So what are the biblical arguments for abstaining from intimate relationships? This first question is really fundamental. We will look at 4 biblical reasons why courtship should not involve two people belonging to each other in an intimate relationship. The first reason is that marriage is sacred. When two people marry, there is a sacred bond that joins them together. There are several biblical reasons why marriage is sacred. God joins two people together for lifelong union. It involves a change in relationship with parents. God designed marriage at the very beginning of creation. God blessed the marriage of Adam and Eve. And marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. To explain why marriage is sacred in detail, let's look at a key verse. Genesis 2, verse 24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." It should be noted that Jesus quotes this verse in Matthew 19, 5 through 6, and adds an additional point that it is God who joins two people together in marriage. Notice the key words, joined together and one flesh. When it says one flesh, it is not referring just to physical union, but spiritual union, where two souls and hearts are joined together. Therefore, from Genesis 2:24, we can conclude that it is a sacred thing to be joined together in a romantic partnership. We can also conclude God has designed lifelong marriage as the only place for romantic fulfillment. Because being joined together is sacred, people should therefore not seek to be joined together in intimate relationships before marriage. So what should courtship involve? Courtship should be a friendship where the goal is to investigate whether marriage is right. In other words, courtship is about choosing a romantic partner, not having a romantic partner. To illustrate this important point, consider this contrast. A married person can say, "We are an item, we have given our hearts to each other, and we are partners." In contrast, if you are courting, you should not say, "We are an item, we have given our hearts to each other," or "we are partners," because these things belong exclusively to marriage. Of course, we live in a world where it is thought normal to have relationships where you are considered to be joined together and an item, but Christians are to be different from the world. To illustrate further why intimate relationships are unbiblical, consider what a church minister sometimes says to the bride and groom at a marriage ceremony. The minister says this, "You have chosen your love, now love your choice." That advice emphasizes the important principle that courtship should be a means to an end, where the end is to choose a marriage partner. Courtship should not be an end in itself, where the end is to have a romantic partner. A second reason why a person should not romantically belong to someone before marriage is that God hates divorce and separation. Malachi 2:16 says this, "For the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce, for it covers one's garment with violence." From this verse, it is clear that divorce is something to be avoided if at all possible. People who have intimate relationships outside of marriage don't get formally divorced. However, they do split up, and those splits are a type of divorce because two people had joined themselves together, and that union is then torn apart. The fact that people speak of the trauma of splitting up demonstrates that relationship splits are a type of romantic divorce. Now, you could argue that if two people stay together in an intimate relationship for life, then they will not go through a relationship split. However, when people choose to have a lifestyle with intimate relationships, it is almost always the case that they expect to have several intimate relationships before marriage, with each one ending with a split. And so having intimate relationships virtually always goes hand in hand with having relationship splits. Therefore, from biblical teaching on divorce, such as Malachi 2:16, we can conclude that it is wrong to have intimate relationships because of the inevitable problem of relationship splits. A third reason why a person should not romantically belong to someone before marriage is that the Bible does not recognize the intimate relationship status. The Bible specifically refers to 3 states a person can be in: the married state, the engaged state, and the single state. And each of these is an honorable state to be in. However, the Bible does not approve of the intimate relationship state, where 2 people belong to each other outside of marriage. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul explains that married people are unique in having a partner. This is what he says in verses 32 and 33. "But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife." Notice how a married man is unique in having to care for a romantic partner. The Apostle Paul assumes that the unmarried man does not have a romantic partner that he must care for. And the reason he assumes that the unmarried man does not have a partner is that the Bible does not recognize such a status. A fourth reason why a person should not romantically belong to someone before marriage is that from Genesis 2:24, it is clear that marriage is the only place where a person can change the relationship status with their parents. A problem with having intimate relationships is that they involve a degree of leaving parents before marriage. When someone has a relationship where they belong to another person, they have an awkward conflict of being under the authority of their parents at the same time as having a commitment to a romantic partner. So we have now considered 4 biblical reasons not to belong to someone in a romantic way before marriage. Despite the fact that the Bible teaches purity before marriage, some Christians argue in support of intimate relationships. I will now deal with 2 of their arguments. Firstly, they say it is too difficult to wait for marriage for romantic pleasures. I would say that of course it is not easy to save yourself for marriage, but as Christians we are called to be holy and to honor marriage. It is also very important to realize that waiting does not mean missing out on romantic pleasures. In my experience, people who save themselves for marriage end up with much greater long-term happiness and fulfillment in romance. Those who have romantic relationships before marriage appear to have lots of romantic pleasures in the short term, but often they ultimately end up with an unfulfilling romantic life. That has been my experience in both my secular work and pastoral work. A second argument people use for intimate relationships is to say that relationships are okay as long as you remember that marriage is the highest form of romantic relationship. But there are big flaws in this argument. How do you define the difference between a lower form and a higher form of romantic relationship? And how do you decide how high an intimate relationship can go before it is such a high form of romantic relationship that it is too close to marriage? Of course, it is impossible to make such definitions because people cannot be 50% joined together or 75% joined together. Either people are joined together or they are not, and they should only be joined together in marriage. Now let us briefly consider the blessings of saving yourself for marriage by treating courtship as just a friendship. Firstly, there is the gift of purity to give to a future spouse, or a period of purity if you have previously had intimate relationships. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, it explains how being a virgin makes a bride attractive. But exactly the same principle is true when someone has abstained from intimate relationships. It makes them more attractive. Of course, virginity is the main way to be pure, but abstaining from intimate relationships is another way of maintaining your purity. We now live in an age where it is common for people to have several intimate relationships with different people before marriage. That creates a lot of baggage to take into marriage, and it is naive to think that people can simply forget their romantic past attachments. The human memory is a powerful thing, and it is hard to forget past attachments and experiences. People who've had intimate relationships have the temptation to think about the enjoyment of romantic moments with past partners, and even to make comparisons with their spouse. So if you save yourself for marriage, you will have less of a problem of emotional baggage. Proverbs 31 speaks of the virtuous wife who does good to her husband all the days of her life. One way to do good to your spouse all the days of your life is to abstain from intimate relationships before marriage. It is common on a wedding day for a husband and wife to exchange gifts. The best gift to give your spouse is that of purity, or at least a period of purity if you've had past relationships. A second blessing of saving yourself for marriage is that it avoids the emotional pressures of an intimate relationship. Many people have experienced the intense pressures that go with being in an intimate relationship. There is the pressure of belonging, the pressure to always be there, the pressure to always answer texts, and the pressure to give sexual pleasures. Even young girls and boys feel these pressures in relationships. But these pressures are not surprising, because if you join yourself to someone in a marriage-like relationship, it is inevitable that you will have the expectations of giving your heart and body away, just like a marriage partner. But thankfully, following biblical standards of courtship helps to avoid such pressures. A third blessing is that it avoids the pain of relationship splits. Many people have experienced the trauma of relationship splits, and some people know that the devastation can be really life-shattering. At one moment, someone can think they're going to share the rest of their lives with someone, and then the next minute, their partner dumps them and their dreams are destroyed. As well as the trauma of the tearing apart of a one-flesh relationship, there are often intense jealousies that arise. For example, when a girl hears that a friend or rival is dating their ex-boyfriend, that can spark extremely angry reactions. Of course, the same can be true for boys and ex-girlfriends. The damage caused by relationship splits is not limited to the two people. As with a full-blown divorce, people take sides and tensions are created between whole families. Sometimes the collateral damage is so great that it causes a church split. The world says that the trauma of relationship splits is an inevitable part of life, but that is not true. If you carry out courtship in a biblical way as a friendship, you will not experience the trauma of a relationship split. Of course, it can be very disappointing if courtship does not lead to engagement, but that disappointment is on a different scale to the pain experienced from the tearing apart of a one-flesh relationship. An additional and important reason why intimate relationships are unbiblical is that the Bible teaches that love should not be awakened until the proper time. In the book of Ecclesiastes, this principle is stated 3 times in chapters 2, 3, and 8. If you enter into an intimate relationship, you are committed to awakening love because you are experiencing marital pleasures like physical intimacy. The expression awakening love helps illustrate the problem with intimate relationships. When you awaken love, you start something powerful that is hard to control and painful to stop. The reason it is painful to stop is that romantic love is designed to be lifelong. Having dealt with our first big question, which is more to do with emotional purity, we now come to our second question about sexual purity. There are several Bible verses that make it clear there should be no sexual intimacy before marriage. We will now consider 3. Hebrews 13:4 says, "Marriage is honourable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge." The book of the Song of Solomon describes marital pleasures such as kissing and sexual touching, which confirms that these activities are for marriage only. And Matthew 5:28 gives us important teaching about lust. Jesus said, "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Lust is defined as any sexual desire outside of marriage. It is impossible to argue that you could engage in kissing or touching without sexual desires, because the whole point of those activities is for sexual pleasure. So from these 3 Bible verses, it is clear that there should be no sexual intimacy in courtship. But this should not be surprising, because if people cannot be joined together outside of marriage, then it makes sense that they cannot give their bodies to each other. Sadly, in modern times, some Christians have made compromises in this area. Some people try to argue that it is okay sexually to touch their girlfriend or boyfriend because their partner has given permission for them to touch them. However, if you are not married to your girlfriend or boyfriend, then they do not belong to you in God's eyes, and so you don't have permission to touch them. Some argue that 2 people should be able to draw their own boundaries of how far to go in intimate touching. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that we can draw our own boundaries of sexual morality. Another problem with the draw your own boundary argument is that a future spouse will probably not agree with the sexual boundaries that their spouse drew in the past. It is important also to realize that in a court of law, kissing and sexual touching are considered to be very serious and can lead to long jail sentences if carried out in unlawful circumstances. So even secular society can see that kissing and sexual touching are significant sexual activities. The Bible says that Christians should flee sexual immorality. One way to obey this command is to abstain from sexual intimacy before marriage. There are several blessings in having sexual purity before marriage. Firstly, there is the gift of sexual purity for your future spouse. Ask yourself this question: would you rather your spouse had not kissed and groped other people before marriage? Of course, the answer is yes. Given that you would prefer your spouse to have pursued purity before marriage, you therefore have a duty to pursue sexual purity yourself before marriage. Secondly, it avoids the serious dangers of having sexual activity outside of marriage. The Bible gives many warnings about the dangers of sexual activity outside of marriage. For example, in Proverbs 6:27, the Bible says, "Can a man take fire to his bosom and his clothes not be burned?" One danger of sex outside of marriage is sexual abuse. At my university, a survey found that around 30% of girls and young women in the United Kingdom had suffered sexual assault in their intimate relationships. The main reason for this sad statistic was that boys thought that their girlfriends belonged to them and they therefore had a right to touch them however they wanted. This illustrates that intimate relationships do not work and are dangerous. The world says that with education, intimate relationships can be made to work. However, the evidence shows clearly that even with education, intimate relationships are inherently dangerous. One of the key reasons they are so dangerous is that intimate relationships involve people making up their own rules about their relationship. This often leads to very different expectations between the man and the woman. There may be very different expectations about where the boundaries of sexual intimacy should be. Also, one person may see the relationship as being for fun, whereas the other person is hoping for marriage. Such conflicts and problems are inevitable because intimate relationships have no fixed rules and boundaries. Only God's design for romance is predictable and safe. And that design involves lifelong marriage. So the way to help make courtship safe is to make it a friendship, not an intimate relationship. Another blessing of sexual abstinence is that it avoids the problem of the slippery slope of increasing sexual activity. A key danger with intimate relationships is that they inevitably get more intimate over time. People think that they can engage in limited kissing and touching and not go further, but God has designed such things to lead to arousal, and so it is naive to think that we have the power not to go further and further. This is why it is not surprising that pregnancies are occurring among single Christians in the church that do not teach biblical courtship. A fourth blessing of abstinence is that it helps society. There are many evils in society that have been caused by the relationship culture, such as abortions, sexual diseases, divorce, and broken lives. When you pursue purity in courtship, you are doing something to help oppose the ungodly relationship culture of the world. You are also supporting the institution of marriage by keeping marriage special. Now let us consider our third question. Should the aim of courtship be to investigate marriage, or can courtship be carried out just for pleasure? This is a really important question because it has a huge effect on whom we choose to court, and also the age at which we start courting. The answer is that because marriage and romance are sacred, the main motivation in courtship should be to make a choice about whether marriage is right. Earlier, we clarified that courtship should be about choosing a marriage partner, not having a marriage partner. Apart from becoming a Christian, choosing a marriage partner is the biggest decision of your life. Therefore, courtship is not something to enter into casually or lightly. Courtship should be pursued only when there is the serious possibility of marriage. Of course, courtship can involve an exciting friendship, especially if it leads to engagement, but courtship should not be pursued just for the sake of pleasure. It's important to note that in past societies that respected biblical standards, it was generally assumed that people would only court in order to consider the possibility of marriage. It is now common to hear of young girls wanting to have a boyfriend simply for the sake of having a boyfriend, not because they are interested in marriage. It is important for Christians to be different from the world by showing that they do not court primarily for pleasure. Now let us consider the blessings of restricting courtship to investigating the possibility of marriage. It stops you rushing into courtship. Courtship might seem very attractive and tempting when you are very young, but it is a sobering thought that it could lead to lifelong marriage. If you are constantly aware that courtship can lead to engagement and marriage, it makes you ask yourself, am I really sure I want to start courting? You have more time to find the right spouse. If you are not getting distracted by intimate relationships, you will have more time and more opportunity to meet more people and find a godly spouse. So what are the problems of courting for pleasure? You may end up marrying foolishly. Imagine you start courting someone mainly because it is fun to court, but then you end up getting serious and eventually you marry that person. And then when you are married, you suddenly look back and realize that you drifted into marrying that person, and you are now not sure if that was a good choice. You see how dangerous it is to court for fun. You may mislead someone in a cruel way. I have heard people say that they know for certain they would not want to marry their boyfriend or girlfriend. At best, such courtship is a complete waste of time. At worst, such courtship can ruin someone's life. Then there is the problem of slipping into serial intimate relationships. When a girl has her first boyfriend at 14 and then suffers the disappointment of that ending, the desire for another boyfriend becomes greater than before, and so a cycle of an ever-increasing need for a boyfriend develops until it becomes an addiction. Before long, that girl is on the road to serial intimate relationships. A fourth problem is that it leads to the wrong criteria for choosing whom you court. If you are courting for pleasure, it is tempting to choose someone on the basis of superficial factors like physical looks. There is even the temptation to court a non-Christian. Now we come to our fourth question. When is a person old enough to start courting? The answer to this question is that since courtship should always have the consideration of marriage in mind, then it follows that a person should be at least nearly old enough to marry and nearly ready to marry. So when is a person old enough to marry? There's no simple answer to this question because it partly depends on local culture and local laws. In most countries and most states in the United States, it is legal to marry with parental consent at 16 and without consent at 18. So on the basis of when it is legal to marry, it is conceivable that courtship could start at the age of 16 or even a little younger. However, this does not necessarily mean it is a good idea to start courting at this age because there is also the important factor of being ready for marriage. A person should only start courting if they are sure they are mature enough and ready for marriage. If you are a 16-year-old girl, it can be tempting to think it is fine to start courting, but you have to ask yourself if you are mature enough and ready for marriage, and if you are prepared to get married in the near future. Of course, you could argue that if you are not ready for marriage, you could then carry out courtship for several years and wait until you are ready for marriage. But this is a risky strategy. What happens if you are still not ready to marry in a few years' time? What happens if the long time period leads to temptations to sexual immorality? It is better not to start courting until you are ready for marriage. And how about the position of a young man? If you are a 16-year-old boy, you also have to ask yourself if you are mature enough for marriage and if you are prepared to get married in the near future before you start courting. In fact, there is an additional question for a young man because the man is normally the main provider for the family. So the young man has to ask himself whether he will be able to financially support a family. Of course, there can be an element of trusting in God's provision and walking by faith. But there must also be realism. How many 16-year-old boys can say they are close to being able to support a family? I don't think the answer is many. In general, a man is going to be 18 years old before he can seriously say he is near being ready to support a family. Having cautioned against starting courtship too young, I should clarify that it is a good thing to desire to marry young, and it is a good thing to marry young. So as soon as you are ready to marry, it is good to seek a spouse in earnest and with God's help. So what are the blessings of waiting until you are ready to marry before starting to court? Firstly, you avoid the emotional damage of having intimate relationships from a very young age. Some people today start having relationships at the age of around 12, and this can lead to many emotional problems. Waiting until you are ready for marriage protects you from such problems. It also encourages maturity. For example, it encourages young men to get ready for the responsibilities of marriage. This is because if young men think they can only court when they are ready to marry, that will then encourage them to get ready for marriage. In past eras, many men used to be mature enough to lead a family by the age of 19 or 20, partly because they assumed courtship was only right if they were ready for marriage. All right then, how should you choose who to court? There are a number of guidelines to consider. We will look at 5. First, you should choose a Christian. The Bible commands that Christians should not be yoked with unbelievers. That's in 2 Corinthians 6:14. Now, if we are commanded to marry a Christian, then it follows that we should only court Christians. There may be a very superficially attractive non-Christian, but there should be no desire to marry them. A Christian lives a life for God, and that affects every decision they make. There is such a big difference in the way a Christian makes decisions that they should never be attracted to a non-Christian. Ignoring this advice can lead to lifelong problems. Second, you should seek God's guidance. Choosing a marriage partner is a really big decision that can greatly affect your whole life. Therefore, it is crucial to seek God's guidance through earnest prayer. You should be cautious in choosing who you court. The Bible says in Proverbs 12:26 that the righteous should choose their friends carefully. This applies to all friendships, but is particularly important for courtship and marriage because of the lifelong consequences. So it is important not to rush into courtship, but to act with caution. Also, you should speak to your parents and pastor for advice. When making a big decision, it is helpful to get advice from other people who may see things from a different perspective. Your parents usually know you better than anyone else, so you should speak to them. It is helpful to also speak to a pastor. There may also be friends who you can ask as well. The idea of discussing with your parents who you choose to court is very unfashionable in modern society. Most 18-year-olds discuss their choice of career with their parents because it is a big decision. But choosing who you decide to court can be an even more important decision if it leads to marriage. So it is right to seek advice from others, such as your parents. Lastly, it is helpful, if possible, to carry out Christian service with people you would consider courting, because then you can learn about the genuineness of their faith and also to see how well you get on with them. Now we come to the sixth question about how to conduct courtship in a practical sense. There are cultural differences that can affect how courtship should be conducted, so it is not possible to make rigid rules. But in general, the following points are honouring to Scripture. The man should usually take the lead in starting courtship because the man has the role of family leadership. Parents should be respected. It is recommended to talk to your parents about what you are doing before you start courting. Sometimes it is appropriate for the man to ask permission of the woman's parents to take her out. It is certainly appropriate for the man to ask permission from a woman's parents for her hand in marriage. Also, don't show off your courtship. In modern society, when people start a new intimate relationship, they will often make a dramatic announcement that they have officially got a new romantic partner, as if they have achieved something very special. But courtship should not be like that, because courtship itself does not involve achieving anything special. Only engagement involves achieving something special, so be careful not to show off your courtship as if it has achieved something. Whilst it is fine for everyone to know that you are courting, it can also be fine to make courtship low-key so that only your parents or family members know that you are courting. Because courtship is a friendship, there is no reason why it has to be made fully public. Also, have no more than a brother-sister type affection. People ask, what type of affection is allowable in courtship? Firstly, it should be remembered that close affection is for marriage only. 1 Corinthians 7:3 teaches that married people should give their spouse the marital affection that they are due. Since close affection is a marital pleasure, courtship should not have close affection, such as long, lingering hugs or physical touching. A good guideline that many Christians follow is to limit affection to that which is appropriate in a brother-sister relationship. Also, don't put pressure on the other person to provide emotional support. With modern technology, it can be tempting to have frequent contact with the other person. There may be such excitement in courtship that you feel like sending 50 texts a day. It can also be tempting to send texts during the middle of the night. But it is important to exercise discipline and not to put pressure on the other person through excessive contact. It is important to be cautious with pledges of love. The world likes to make pledges of love early in a relationship, but these pledges are usually premature and not lifelong. Remember that if you tell the other person that you love them, you are starting to put pressure on them to respond. Remember, you can back out at any time. There should be no guilt about finishing the courtship because there is no splitting up of a one-flesh relationship. And finally, avoid temptation. Avoiding temptation is an important biblical principle. One obvious application of this is to avoid being alone in a secluded place like a bedroom. Another application is for women not to dress seductively, whether they are courting or not courting. The book of Proverbs teaches that seduction is a sin in the same way that lust is a sin. One question is how long engagement should be. Now, every situation is different, so there can be no hard rules about the length of engagement. However, to avoid temptation, it is preferable not to have too long an engagement. Another question is exactly how binding is engagement. Engagement is not binding like marriage, so if one partner changes their mind about marriage, then they can back out. However, it should be remembered that a breakup of an engagement can be really devastating. Whereas courtship involves no promise of commitment, engagement involves a very serious intention to marry. Therefore, a person should only get engaged when they are really sure that marriage is right, so that there is only a small chance of an engagement breaking up. Another question is whether physical intimacy is allowable in engagement. Whilst engagement involves a promise between two people to marry, it is still right to abstain from all sexual intimacy. One reason is that there is always the possibility of the engagement breaking up. A second reason is to avoid the temptation to go too far. A third reason is to keep the wedding day special. Before we conclude, I just want to address a couple of issues. The first relates to terminology. It is not easy to know what terms to recommend when talking about courtship because it partly depends on the local culture. In this presentation, I have talked about two people who are, quotes, courting. I like the term courtship because it literally means courting the possibility of being joined together in marriage. This helps clarify that courtship should be a means to an end to investigate marriage and not an end in itself. I personally think the term relationship is not so ideal because it makes it less clear that two people are investigating marriage. When someone says that they are, quote, in a relationship, this can sometimes give the impression that the relationship is an end in itself. So I personally prefer the term courtship. One term I certainly would not recommend is that of partner. Only in marriage can two people say that they have romantic partners who they belong to. In principle, there is nothing wrong with the terms boyfriend and girlfriend, as long as they are not used in a way that makes them sound like partners. I also want to briefly mention some very good Christian books on the topic of courtship. I think Elizabeth Elliot has written one of the best books called Passion and Purity. That title illustrates two important points. It is fine to have passion when seeking a marriage partner, but it is also important to have purity. Now in review, it is important to understand and follow biblical teaching on romance and marriage. The Bible commands Christians to honor marriage. One of the ways to honor marriage is to avoid having sex and relationships before marriage. The Bible makes it very clear that God has designed marriage as the only place for romantic fulfillment and romantic partnerships. Marriage is sacred, and so man should not make an alternative to marriage by having romantic partnerships outside of marriage. It follows that courtship should be a means to an end, where the end is to investigate marriage. Courtship should not be an end in itself, where the end is to have the pleasure of an intimate relationship. The Bible also makes it clear that if we follow God's design and save ourselves for marriage, we will have many blessings and protections. And even if we do not end up marrying in the future, we will still be blessed by pursuing purity in courtship. In contrast, if we go against God's design for romance and seek romantic fulfillment outside of marriage, we will experience many problems and dangers. It is also important to understand how our modern society has gone away from biblical standards and to recognize the consequences of that. Intimate relationships appeal to modern society because they involve marital pleasures without the commitment of lifelong marriage. But the damaging consequences are clear to see in terms of broken lives, high abortion rates, high divorce rates, and even lifetimes of failed relationships. Thirdly, it is important to remember that if you have made mistakes in this area, there is complete forgiveness from God, and it is never too late to change. As a final point, people often ask the question, how far can I go? The answer to this question is this: it is the wrong question. The right question is, how pure can I be? And the answer to this question is that you can be entirely pure by abstaining from intimate relationships and abstaining from physical intimacy. I pray that you will know God's help in seeking to honor marriage and honor biblical teaching in courtship.